a girl entered the house of a rich family looking for some food. When she opened a door in the basement, she found an old man crying, tied to the bed, and Sophie woke up to the sound of wind battering the cracks in the old windows of her apartment. Through the rays of sunlight that filtered through the gaps, she could see the dust floating in the air, as if time itself had stopped in this corner of the world. In the small room with cracked walls, life seemed like a constant struggle. The old wall clock, which no longer worked, marked the hours erratically, and the echo of the ticking reminded everyone that time was slipping through their fingers. Sophie slowly sat up, stretching her arms with effort. She was only 12 years old, but the weight of life on her felt that of someone much older. Her mother, Rose, and her brother Matthew depended on her to survive. Rose was sick, her constant cough echoing in every corner of the small apartment, and her body no longer seemed like the strong woman it once was. Since the death of her husband, a factory worker who lost his life in a work accident, everything had gone from bad to worse. The system that was supposed to protect families like hers offered them no help. Her father's death had left an economic void, emotional scars, and above all, a wound that wouldn't heal. Sophie walked toward her mother's room, where she found Rose sitting on the worn-out sofa, holding Matthew, who was playing on the floor with his little toy car. Rose's eyes, sunken from fever and exhaustion, lifted when she saw Sophie. She smiled weakly, though it was a smile that failed to light up her face. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" Sophie asked gently. Rose could barely answer. A cough interrupted her, and her face turned pale from the effort. Sophie tried not to show the fear she felt for her mother, but the weight of concern hung over her like a dark cloud. "More tired, daughter. But don't worry about me. Did you find something for breakfast?" Rose replied, her voice broken, as if speaking cost her more than it should. Sophie looked around, knowing the answer would be the same as always. There was nothing. No bread, no milk, not even something as simple as a fruit. Yet, she didn't want to show her mother that the situation was even more desperate than it seemed. "I'll find something, Mom," Sophie said, offering a smile that couldn't hide her sadness. She got up and went out into the building's hallway, the door creaking as she passed. The air inside the building was thick with humidity and dust. The walls, once white, were now covered in mold stains and cracks that spread like scars throughout the place. The silence in the hallways was only interrupted by the sound of Sophie's footsteps and the occasional distant thud of other doors, where other families struggled with their own pain. Outside, the day was cool, and the sun barely reached the cobblestone streets of the neighborhood. Sophie walked quickly, glancing around. She knew the neighborhood market had already opened, but as always, there wouldn't be much to get. The market, once full of people and life, now seemed more like a place where scraps were traded. Sophie walked the streets, hoping someone might have something to give her. But today, like many other times, the answers were the same. "There's nothing, girl," or "Sorry, I sold everything." Finally, exhausted and with an empty stomach, Sophie sat down in a corner of the market. The daylight had become brighter, and the vendors began to pack up their stalls. Sophie looked at her hands, stained with dirt, and thought of her mother. Rose, who had become a shadow of herself, could no longer move much. Every cough, every deep breath, seemed harder than the last. Sophie felt time slipping through her hands, as if the future was not a promise, but an increasingly heavy burden. The girl stood up, determined. If she couldn't find food here, she would have to go further. She walked aimlessly through the streets, beyond the familiar ones, into the wealthy district of the city, a place that seemed like a completely different world. The houses were large, ostentatious, surrounded by perfectly maintained gardens and expensive cars parked in front of the doors. The luxury buildings shone with an elegance that seemed to mock the scars of the neighborhood where Sophie lived. The contrast was unbearable, and Sophie, though used to inequality, couldn't help but feel small and invisible. Here, in this world so far from hers, no one seemed to care about those who, like her, struggled to survive. Sophie moved through the streets, desperately searching for an opportunity. Then, a smell of freshly cooked food reached her nose. It was like the siren's call. Sophie looked up and saw the largest mansion she had ever seen. Its white stone facade reflected the blue sky, the windows gleamed, and the garden, perfectly manicured, looked like something from a fairy tale. She approached without thinking much, drawn by the aroma that filled the air. But as she got closer, she could hear voices coming from the house. It was an argument, a man and a woman. The man's voice, firm and authoritative, cut through the air, while the woman barely responded. Sophie, despite her curiosity, couldn't shake the strange feeling that came from hearing the tension in their words. Through a slightly open window, she saw Hector Morales, the owner of the mansion, arguing with his wife, Clara. The conversation was full of reproaches, but Sophie couldn't understand all the details. What she did understand was that there was something dark and oppressive in the atmosphere of the mansion. Before she could reflect further on what she had heard, the need for food took over her mind again. She looked around and saw that the mansion's wall was high, almost impossible to climb. However, something caught her attention. A small basement window was ajar, as if someone had left it slightly open. Without thinking twice, Sophie carefully approached, and with the agility her small size gave her, slipped through the opening, entering the mansion quietly. The air in the basement was cold and thick. As Sophie hit the ground, she quickly got up and looked around. The place was dark and filled with boxes, furniture covered with sheets, and shelves full of forgotten objects. Despite the fear, her curiosity pushed her to keep exploring, searching for what she needed for her family. Soon, she found a pantry with some cans, packages of cookies, and bottles of water. Although it wasn't much, Sophie stuffed everything she could into her backpack. But as she tried to leave, a closed door caught her attention. A thick iron lock secured the entrance. Something about that door intrigued her, as if it concealed a dark secret. As she approached, she noticed a small gap at the bottom. She crouched down and peered through it. Inside, she saw something that would haunt her forever. An old man, tied to a bed, crying silently. The room was almost dark, with only a dim lamp lighting his gaunt face. The man murmured something between sobs, but Sophie couldn't make out his words. Her heart raced, and a lump formed in her throat. Just then, she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Hector, probably. Panic overwhelmed her, and without thinking, Sophie grabbed the cans and water and ran toward the window she had entered. The cold air from the street hit her face as she stepped outside, but she didn't stop. She ran without looking back, leaving the mansion behind her, her mind filled with questions and fear. That night, as the city sank into darkness, Sophie curled up in her bed, trying to sleep, but the images of the old man in the basement continued to torment her. She knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. Something was wrong in that mansion, and although the danger was palpable, Sophie understood that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just fighting to survive. Now she had to face something much bigger. The next morning arrived with a clear sky, but the feeling of oppression Sophie felt in her chest did not disappear. The image of the old man tied in the mansion's basement, his tears and unintelligible murmurs, still lingered in her mind. That vision wouldn't let her rest, not even when her mother woke her with a slight cough, a cough that, with each passing day, seemed to make it harder for her to breathe. Sophie didn't want to talk about what she'd seen, not yet. She had too many unanswered questions. Who was that old man? Why was he locked up? And most importantly, why had no one helped him? While her mother tried to get ready as best as she could, Sophie decided she had to go back to the mansion. There was something in that house she couldn't ignore, something that called to her with an irresistible force. The girl looked at Matthew, who was distractedly playing with his car, then at her mother, who was still trying with effort to stand. Sophie knew that, although her mother insisted she not worry, the reality was that everything depended on her. They couldn't live like this in misery, and the problem wouldn't be solved with just a few coins. She needed something more, something big. And for some reason, something in that mansion seemed to be the key. If she could uncover the truth behind what she had seen, maybe she would find a way to change her fate. She quickly said goodbye to her mother and left the apartment. As she walked through the familiar alleyways of the neighborhood, the contrast with what she was about to see unsettled her even more. There was something in her that pushed her toward the unknown, toward what she didn't fully understand, but deep inside, she knew she had to discover it. The neighborhood, with its dusty streets and worn-down buildings, was all Sophie knew. The murmurs of the neighbors and the sounds of street vendors were her world. Every day she faced the same routine, the search for something to bring home, the uncertainty of not knowing if she would find enough food or if her mother could endure another day with her health in such poor condition. But as she moved farther from her home and neared the wealthy district, the change was immediate. The transition from one world to another was almost surreal. The streets became wider and cleaner, the buildings taller and more modern. Luxury cars gleamed under the sun, and the houses, surrounded by large, perfectly manicured gardens, stood imposingly like castles from a fairy tale that Sophie had never imagined. The luxury radiating from every corner was so alien to her daily life that, for a moment, she didn't know if she belonged in this world. It was like walking in a distant dream, a dream where people didn't suffer, didn't fear poverty or illness. Everything seemed perfect, unreal. Sophie looked around, observing the mansions that lined the main street. In an instant, she realized she had no idea where to start. But just as doubt began to cloud her determination, the smell of freshly cooked food caught her attention, like a beacon in the darkness. It was the same scent she had noticed the night before, the one that had led her to Hector Morales' mansion. Without thinking, she stepped into the mansion's entrance. It was even larger than she remembered. The white stone walls glowed under the sun, and the windows reflected the clear sky. The gardens were so well kept that it seemed as though someone spent hours tending to them every day. The contrast with the chaos of her own home was brutal, and as Sophie approached, she couldn't help but feel like an intruder in this place so foreign to her. She slowly approached the door, where a couple of workers were tending to the garden. No one seemed to be inside, so Sophie dared to look through the window. From there, she could hear the voices. It was the same argument she had overheard the day before, now more intense, more filled with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Clara," shouted a deep, authoritative male voice. Sophie could make out Hector Morales, the owner of the mansion, standing next to a table in the living room, visibly agitated. His tone was dominant, with no room for negotiation. Clara, his wife, barely responded. Sophie saw her figure in the distance, head lowered, as if she didn't have the energy to face her husband's fury. Their exchanges were tense, full of reproaches, and although Sophie couldn't understand every word, the atmosphere was oppressive, almost suffocating. The scene made her question whether something so perfect could really be. If in this world of wealth and luxury, there was space for suffering. But Sophie didn't have time to dwell on that. What mattered now was her family's hunger, her mother's health, and what she had seen in the mansion's basement. She knew something dark was happening there, but she still didn't understand why. Just as curiosity began to consume her, Sophie noticed something strange. The basement window was slightly open, as if someone had forgotten to close it properly. The opportunity was perfect. She could sneak in without anyone noticing. Without thinking twice, Sophie approached the wall, and with agility, she slipped through the opening, entering the basement carefully. The cold air inside enveloped her, and the contrast with the warm sun outside made her feel like she had entered another world. The basement was spacious, filled with boxes, furniture covered with sheets, and disordered shelves. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her shallow breathing. The pantry was close, and Sophie quickly filled her backpack with the cans and bottles she found. At that moment, hunger was no longer her only concern. Something else, something bigger, was driving her to keep exploring, as if an unknown force was pushing her forward. She walked toward the back of the basement, where a locked door stopped her. Sophie approached cautiously, noticing a small crack at the bottom. She looked through it, and what she saw froze her. An elderly man, tied to a bed, his gaunt face marked by tears slowly falling down his cheeks. Sophie felt paralyzed. The image of that old man pierced her, and a flame of desperation ignited in her chest. Who was he? Why was he there? Before she could react, the sound of approaching footsteps made her panic. She grabbed what she had found and rushed to leave through the same window she had entered. The cold street air hit her face as she stepped outside, but she didn't stop. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, while her mind spun with the questions she still had no answers to. The Morales mansion was no longer just a place of wealth and luxury. It had become the setting for something much darker, and Sophie knew she couldn't just stand by. That night, as the silence of her home enveloped her, Sophie curled up in bed, feeling the weight of what she had seen. What was happening in that mansion couldn't go unanswered. Something inside her told her she had to return, that she had to uncover the truth, even if that meant facing danger. The story of that old man couldn't be ignored, and Sophie knew she wouldn't rest until she unraveled all the secrets that Hector Morales' mansion concealed. That night, Sophie barely slept. The images of the old man, his face marked by suffering, and the strange sensation of having witnessed something forbidden, continued to haunt her. As she tried to sleep in the darkness of her small room, the echoes of the old man's murmurs in the basement resonated in her head. The unintelligible words she had heard kept spinning in her mind. Who was that man? Why was he there, tied up, isolated from the world? The answer to those questions seemed so close, yet so out of reach. The next morning, Sophie woke up with renewed determination. She couldn't stay with the uncertainty. She had to find out the truth. She decided she would go back to the mansion. Although her intuition told her it wasn't safe, she couldn't let the old man's suffering be forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, and Sophie felt that something much bigger was at play. She left her apartment quickly, leaving her mother to rest, hoping that the rest would give her some relief. Matthew, unaware of the gravity of the situation, played with his car on the floor of the room. Sophie gave him a sad smile before stepping out into the streets of her neighborhood, where misery and exhaustion were a constant. She walked with a firm step, not allowing the daily struggles to stop her. The fate of her family depended on what she could discover in that mansion. When she arrived in the wealthy neighborhood, the difference with her own world was more evident than ever. The houses, like marble and stone castles, seemed to overshadow everything Sophie knew. Every corner of Hector Morales' mansion stood out in the midst of the opulence. The contrast between life in her neighborhood and life in this place was almost unbearable. But Sophie didn't have time to reflect on those differences. What awaited her behind those walls was much more important. She approached the mansion cautiously, this time with a more marked sense of urgency. She knew something was happening there, something she couldn't ignore. She stopped at the side of the house, near the garden, to make sure no one saw her. Not seeing anyone, Sophie made her way to the basement, where she remembered the window was still slightly open. Her heart raced, but her determination was stronger. There was something inside that house that needed to be revealed. She slipped through the window with agility, making no noise, and found herself back in the basement, that dark and cold place she already knew. The shelves filled with old objects, the boxes covered with white sheets, everything looked the same as it had the night before. However, the air was thicker, as if something more had been added to the unsettling atmosphere of the place. Sophie walked carefully through the basement, heading toward the locked door with the same padlock she had seen before. Something was driving her to discover what was behind it. As she approached the door, her heart began to beat faster. She couldn't help but feel fear, but the need to know the truth kept her steady. She crouched down once again to look through the crack at the bottom of the door. What she saw took her breath away. The old man was there, exactly in the same position as the night before, tied to the bed with thick straps that kept him immobilized. His face, marked by the passage of time, was covered in sweat and tears. His frail, thin body moved weakly, but it was clear that he couldn't free himself. The old man's eyes, though clouded by suffering, stared into the void as if waiting for something or someone. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about what that man must have been going through. How long had he been there? What had brought him to such a cruel fate? Her instinct told her she had to help him, but she didn't know how. She knew she couldn't do it alone, that she would need more than courage to free this man from the prison he was in. Suddenly, a thought hit her like a bolt of lightning. What if the old man was the true owner of the mansion? What if, as she had suspected, Hector had taken control of the house and kept him captive to take everything that belonged to him? Sophie couldn't stay there much longer. The danger of being discovered was always present. She quickly stood up, not taking her eyes off the old man, and prepared to leave the basement. But just as she took her first step toward the window, she had entered through. She heard footsteps coming down the stairs. A chill ran down her spine. Someone was approaching. Her breath quickened. She couldn't stay there another second. With nerves on edge, Sophie swiftly slipped toward the window and, with considerable effort, managed to escape quietly. The fresh morning air hit her face, and though she felt relieved to have escaped, she knew she couldn't leave things as they were. The old man was still there, trapped, and her mission had only just begun. Sophie began walking quickly, not looking back. Her thoughts raced 1,000 miles an hour. She didn't know how she would do it, but she knew she couldn't stop fighting for this cause. The pain and suffering of the old man reflected something much bigger, something Sophie had to unravel, even if it meant confronting what appeared to be a perfect world filled with dark secrets. That night, when she returned to her apartment, Sophie sat with her mother and brother, but her mind remained at Hector Morales' mansion. The image of the old man and the feeling of helplessness haunted her. She knew she couldn't go back to the mansion without a plan, but she also knew something big and dangerous was unfolding. The fate of that man didn't just depend on him, it also depended on her. Sophie could no longer ignore the truth. She had seen something that she could not erase. The Morales mansion was not just a place of luxury and wealth, it was a prison of lies and cruelty. And she, a 12-year-old girl, had become the only hope for the captive man. The sun had set, and the moonlight filtered through the broken curtains of Sophie's small room. Despite the silence of the night, her mind could not find rest. The images of the old man in the basement, trapped and crying in his bed, repeated endlessly in her mind. Sophie couldn't shake the thought that something much bigger was happening at the Morales mansion, something that not only involved a defenseless man, but a system of oppression and cruelty. Fear had begun to settle in her heart, but the need to do what was right kept her alert. The next morning, Sophie woke up early. Her mother was still asleep, lost in her fever, and Matthew played with his toy car in the corner of the room, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Sophie knew she couldn't wait any longer. The weight of what she had seen in the basement was consuming her. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't live with the uncertainty. The fate of the old man, her own family, and maybe many others, depended on what she discovered at Hector Morales' mansion. Before leaving, Sophie approached her mother, gently stroked her hair, and promised that she would return soon with good news. Although she didn't know how soon she could come back, the promise of helping her mother gave her strength. She walked down the hallway of the building with a firm step, determined to face whatever came her way. The neighborhood where she lived seemed the same as always: gray streets, concrete buildings, children playing among the rubble. The contrast with the world Sophie was about to enter was palpable. The houses in the wealthy district, with their perfectly manicured gardens and large gates, had always seemed foreign to her, as if they belonged to another world. But now, that world represented not just luxury and power, but also something much darker. Sophie couldn't let it go unchallenged. When she reached the front of Hector Morales' mansion, Sophie took a closer look than ever at the details that had previously only seemed luxurious and foreign. The white stone facade gleamed in the sunlight, and the large windows reflected the clear sky. But something inside Sophie told her that all of that was a facade, a set designed to hide what really happened inside. She knew she couldn't face this alone, and although the decision filled her with fear, Sophie decided that she needed help. She cautiously approached the back of the mansion, where she had seen a young man working in the garden the day before. Joseph, the gardener, seemed like a key piece in all of this, and Sophie felt that she could trust him. At first, she had hesitated, but now, more than ever, she needed someone to confide in. Joseph had shown a hint of concern in his eyes when she snuck into the mansion the night before, and Sophie knew that couldn't be a coincidence. She hid behind a hedge, watching as Joseph worked, focused on his tasks. As soon as she saw him walk away from the garden and head toward the back of the mansion, Sophie decided to approach quietly. Fear kept her alert, but her determination was stronger. When she was close enough, Sophie called out softly. Joseph turned, initially surprised, but quickly relaxed when he saw it was her. "What are you doing here, girl?" Joseph asked, his voice soft, though there was a trace of concern in his eyes. Sophie didn't hesitate for a second. She needed answers. "I saw what's happening in the basement. I saw the man. He's trapped, and I know it's not right." Sophie spoke quickly, almost without breathing, as her words tumbled out of her mind. Joseph stared at her, and for a moment, Sophie thought he might reject her, tell her to leave. But instead, she saw a mixture of fear and resignation in his face. "I knew something was wrong," Joseph finally said quietly, looking around as if he feared someone might overhear. "But I can't do much. Hector is dangerous. If he finds out someone is messing with his affairs, the consequences will be bad for everyone." Sophie, determined, couldn't let Joseph's fear stop her. "I know," she replied, her voice firm. "But I can't stand by knowing someone is there, suffering. He needs help. And I'm going to help him, even if it's the last thing I do." Joseph watched her in silence for a long moment, and finally, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "You're right. Something has to be done." His voice was full of doubt, but also growing resolve. "But we can't do it without planning everything carefully. If Hector finds out we're helping that man, it won't just hurt you, it will hurt the whole family. And not only that, he has people around him, people who would do anything for him." Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of his words. There was no turning back, but now that Joseph was willing to help, the situation seemed more possible. "What should we do?" Sophie asked, a slight glimmer of renewed hope in her voice. Joseph crouched down and began to look around, making sure they weren't being watched. His tone grew more serious. "First, we need to know more. I've been working here for months, but I've never had access to the private rooms. I only know that the man in the basement, the one Hector keeps down there, is Hector's uncle, Mr. Sebastian. Hector took control of the mansion after Mr. Sebastian fell ill, but people in the neighborhood whisper that he's keeping him prisoner to take everything that belongs to him." Sophie listened intently, absorbing every word. "How do we know what you're saying is true?" she asked, looking for a clearer clue. Joseph looked at her seriously and handed her a small, crumpled piece of paper. "This is a fragment of an old contract that Hector kept among his papers. I don't know if it'll help, but it talks about some properties that shouldn't have been transferred. I know Mr. Sebastian never signed those papers. If you can find something more, something that proves it, we can help him." Sophie took the paper with trembling hands, but her heart began to race. She was no longer alone in this. Now, with this clue in hand, something could be done. "Thank you, Joseph," she said, gratitude in her voice. "I'll need more than just this piece of paper. I need to know what else is hidden in this mansion." Joseph nodded, his face still grave. "All right, but be careful, Sophie. This isn't a game. If Hector finds out what we're doing, the consequences could be worse than you imagine." Sophie nodded firmly. She could no longer stop. She knew she was facing something much bigger than herself, but she also knew she couldn't let Mr. Sebastian's life be lost in the shadows. "I'm going to do it," she replied, with the same determination that had pushed her this far. Joseph looked at her for a moment, concerned, but finally took a step back. "Then, let's move forward." And with one last glance at the mansion, he added, "But remember, Sophie, not everything that glitters is gold. Be careful with what you uncover." Sophie nodded and quickly walked away, her mind already forming a new strategy. With Joseph's help and the fragment of the contract in her hand, she knew she had a chance. The game had just begun. Sophie spent the rest of the day filled with a mix of nervousness and determination. The crumpled paper Joseph had given her felt heavy in her pocket, but as the day went on, her focus sharpened on what she needed to do. The fragment of the contract could be useful, but it wasn't enough. She needed something more solid, something that could truly bring Hector Morales down and free Mr. Sebastian. However, with every step she took, she was getting closer to a danger she didn't yet fully understand. She decided to return to the mansion that same night. She knew she couldn't wait much longer. Time was running out, and her mother continued to worsen. The sooner she could uncover what was really happening in that house, the sooner she could help her family. But not only that, the image of the old man, his face marked by desperation, kept persisting in her mind. Mr. Sebastian didn't deserve to be there, and if Sophie could do something to free him, she would, even if it meant facing a monster. The Morales mansion, imposing and radiant under the moonlight, looked even more distant and unreachable than the last time. Sophie stopped in the garden, watching from behind the hedge that hid her. This time, she knew she couldn't enter through the basement window without drawing attention. She needed a more cunning, more careful plan. She waited for the staff to move away and seized a moment when the gardens were empty to approach the trash bin behind the mansion. There, in a dark corner, she found what she had been looking for, an old notebook covered in dust and partially torn, as if it had been discarded hastily. Sophie quickly crouched down and picked it up. Her heart raced at the thought that this could be the key to solving everything. She hid it under her coat and, without looking back, ran to a corner where she could safely open it, away from the curious eyes of the staff. Under the dim light of a flashlight she had brought, she began flipping through the pages. At first, it seemed like a simple personal notebook. The early pages were filled with daily notes about caring for the house and the visits Mr. Sebastian received from his friends and acquaintances. But as she went on, the words began to change. It was no longer about daily routines. The tone became more desperate, more fearful. The last pages were filled with mentions of a nephew, Hector, and how he had started to take control of Mr. Sebastian's properties. At the end of the notebook, the words were clear and worrying. "I don't know who to trust or what to do. Hector has started to take everything that's mine. I know I'm losing control of my faculties, but something inside me tells me that I'm not incapable. My nephew is manipulating me, forging documents to take everything I've worked for, even the will. I think I hid it, but I no longer know where. This is bigger than I thought." Sophie couldn't help but feel shaken. Mr. Sebastian's words confirmed what she had suspected. Hector was not only stealing his uncle's property, but he had locked him in the basement to make sure no one could intervene. And even more, the will, which was probably the key to returning everything to Mr. Sebastian, was hidden somewhere in the mansion. Sophie felt like she had found a crucial piece of the puzzle, but she also knew there were still many unanswered questions. She needed to find that will. If she could locate it, she could expose Hector to everyone. But the question was, where would Mr. Sebastian have hidden it? He must have had time to think, and she knew a man as clever as him wouldn't leave something so important in plain sight. She decided that the first thing she needed to do was make sure no one would discover her. She tucked the notebook back under her coat and quickly left for the back of the mansion, where she saw a light on the upper floor. She didn't know who was there, but she preferred not to take any risks. As she approached the basement, memories of the previous night flooded her mind. The locked door, the old man's cries, the feeling of venturing into a dangerous place. That place, seemingly so perfect, hid secrets as dark as the basement itself. Sophie knew she had to be cautious, but the truth was so close now that she couldn't step back. When she reached the entrance to the basement, she approached the window cautiously, but as she looked around, she heard footsteps approaching. Sophie held her breath and hid behind a trash bin, her eyes wide open. The sound of the footsteps was unmistakable. Someone was coming. It was a man, walking steadily, passing close to the window. Sophie recognized him. It was the gardener, Joseph. Joseph approached, unaware that Sophie was watching him. He stopped near the window and looked around as though he was watching the surroundings. Sophie stayed still, afraid he might spot her. But to her surprise, Joseph crouched slightly, and after taking one last glance around, something Sophie hadn't expected happened. He took a key from his jacket pocket and inserted it into the lock of the basement door. Sophie gasped. Joseph, without a word, opened the door with a furtive gesture and after glancing around quickly closed it again. Sophie felt like her blood had turned to ice. Joseph had been helping Hector, but now he was also opening the door that she thought only he could pass through. She wondered for a moment if there was more to Joseph's loyalty to the Morales family, or if he was just as trapped in the same web of lies and manipulation as everyone else. Although doubts filled her mind, Sophie stood up with determination. She had come too far to turn back. Now that Joseph had opened the door, she had the perfect opportunity to learn more. She approached the basement stealthily, hoping not to be discovered. She entered cautiously, knowing time was not on her side. The mansion no longer seemed so imposing and shiny, but rather something much darker and murkier, a place where secrets were hidden between its walls. Sophie took a step forward, with the notebook in her hand, hoping that soon she would understand everything that had been happening behind those walls. But she also knew that each step she took brought her closer to danger. Now, more than ever, she had to be careful. Every decision could mean the difference between freeing Mr. Sebastian or sinking deeper into the lie Hector had created. The cool morning air filtered through the cracks in the window of Sophie's small apartment, bringing with it a sense of calm that contrasted with the whirlwind of thoughts that kept her awake. Sophie had returned from the Morales mansion, but her mind was still caught up in the details of what she had discovered. Mr. Sebastian's notebook, the hidden will, and most of all, the key Joseph had used to open the basement door. She knew she couldn't do it alone anymore. She had come too far, and the only way to secure Mr. Sebastian's freedom was by allying herself with someone else. But who could help her? The only name that came to mind was Julie, Hector Morales' daughter. Julie was young, like her, but with a world that couldn't be more different. Sophie had always watched her from a distance, observing how Julie lived in her bubble of luxury, oblivious to the struggles of families like hers. However, as she had overheard whispers at the mansion and heard Joseph's words about the family tension, Sophie had begun to wonder if Julie really knew the truth about what was happening under her own roof. The decision was made. Sophie knew that if she wanted to save Mr. Sebastian and get the necessary proof to expose Hector, she needed to get close to Julie. But she didn't know how she would react. She could reject her, call her a liar, betray her. All of that crossed her mind as she made her way to the mansion that morning. When she arrived, Sophie noticed that the mansion was as imposing and shiny as ever, but something in the air had changed. There was a palpable tension, something that couldn't be ignored. The same feeling Sophie had the first time she entered there, only now it was stronger, more present. She walked through the garden, her heart racing, until she saw Julie. The young woman was sitting in one of the garden chairs, surrounded by books, with a thoughtful expression that didn't seem to match the luxury-filled life she led. Sophie watched her for a long moment, wondering how she could approach her without scaring her or causing conflict. Without thinking further, Sophie walked up to Julie, took a deep breath, and stood in front of her. "Julie," she said with a firm voice, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I need to talk to you." Julie looked up, surprised. Her face was a mix of surprise and distrust, but she didn't look away. "What are you doing here?" Julie asked, her tone a bit cold but not aggressive. "If my father sees you, he'll throw you out." Sophie tried to smile, but she couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I need to know something, Julie. Something about your father. Something about what's happening in this house." Julie furrowed her brow, confused. She didn't seem to understand what Sophie meant, but the seriousness in her words made her think. "What are you implying?" Julie asked, her voice now a bit more tense. Sophie took a step forward, feeling that she couldn't back down. She knew that if she didn't say it now, maybe she never would. "I know what's happening in the basement. I saw what your father is doing to your grandfather, to Mr. Sebastian. He's locked up there. And not only that, I also know that he has forged documents to take everything that's his. He's been stealing, Julie. And you don't know this, but what's happening here is very serious. You don't know it, but your father is a thief, a criminal." Julie stood up abruptly, surprised and upset, but at the same time, something in her face changed. There was a shadow of doubt in her eyes, as if something Sophie had said resonated with her. "That's a lie," Julie replied, crossing her arms over her chest, her voice trembling. "You can't come here accusing my father of that. You don't know anything about what's happening in my house." Sophie looked her in the eyes, not breaking eye contact, knowing that she couldn't give up. Her mission was too important. "I know because I saw it. I saw Mr. Sebastian in the basement. He was tied to a bed, crying. How can you say it's not true? Your father is slowly killing your grandfather, and you can't see it." Julie stepped back, clearly shaken by Sophie's words. Her eyes blurred for a moment, as if she were processing everything Sophie had just said. "No, I don't know what you're talking about," Julie said, but her tone now sounded uncertain. "My father wouldn't do that. He couldn't." Seeing the confusion on Julie's face, Sophie felt a little closer to achieving what she needed. She couldn't give up. She knew that Julie, though distrusting, was also starting to question what was happening in her house. She was at the same crossroads Sophie had recently faced, the fear of the unknown and the truth. "Do you really think your father is doing the right thing?" Sophie asked, her gaze firm. "I didn't know either until I saw with my own eyes what's going on here. And now I can't stand by. You can't either. I need your help, Julie. I need you to help me free your grandfather." Sophie's words fell heavily on Julie, who stared at her, unsure how to react. Sophie watched her, hoping the young woman would understand the gravity of the situation. After what seemed like an eternity, Julie lowered her gaze and sighed deeply. "I don't know if I can do this. If my father finds out I'm involved, he would exile me from his life. He would hate me." "You don't have to do it alone," Sophie replied, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "I'll help you. I'm taking risks too. But if we do nothing, things will never change. Mr. Sebastian needs your help. He's not just your grandfather. He's the man your father has been exploiting." Julie was silent for a moment, weighing Sophie's words. Finally, her expression softened. In her eyes, there was a mix of sadness and frustration, but also a hint of determination. "All right, I'll help you," she said, her voice finally taking on a firmer tone. "But I need to know everything you've discovered. If this is going to work, we need to know exactly what we're facing." Sophie felt a wave of relief upon hearing her. She had achieved what she set out to do. She had made Julie understand the magnitude of what was happening. Now, together, they could face Hector Morales and try to free Mr. Sebastian. "Thank you, Julie," Sophie said with a smile, though she knew this was just the beginning of a dangerous fight. "Together, we'll make this end." Julie nodded, though her face still reflected doubt, but she had taken the first step. And that, for Sophie, was the most important thing. At that moment, both knew they couldn't turn back. The truth had started to come to light, and now was the time to fight for it. The Morales mansion, which until recently had seemed like an impenetrable fortress, was now a hidden battlefield between hallways, locked doors, and buried secrets. Sophie and Julie met in secret, both increasingly convinced that Mr. Sebastian's fate depended on them. Sophie's determination had taken root in Julie, but she couldn't ignore the fear she felt about confronting her own father, a man she had always considered the pillar of her life. The plan was risky, but each passing day made the truth more urgent. Sophie had convinced Julie of the gravity of the situation, and now they faced the enormous task of unraveling the mansion's secrets and finding evidence that could destroy the web of lies Hector Morales had built. That morning, Sophie woke up early as usual, but the feeling of nervousness was palpable. She knew that her next visit to the mansion could not only reveal more secrets, but could also put them in an even more dangerous position. With Mr. Sebastian's notebook still tucked in her backpack, the thought that something so important could be hidden in the depths of that house kept swirling in her mind. However, she couldn't do it alone. She needed Julie's support, who now seemed as determined as she was. She met Julie at noon, in a secluded corner of the mansion's garden where they could speak without being seen. The young woman was tenser than ever, her normally confident face now reflecting deep concern. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, Sophie," Julie said, her voice low but firm. "And I'm determined to help you. But I'm also scared. Not just about what might happen if my father finds out I'm involved, but about what's happening in this house. I don't know who to trust here." Sophie understood her fear, and she couldn't blame her. The place where Julie had grown up, full of wealth and comforts, now seemed like a maze of lies. Julie's inner struggle was clear, but in her eyes, there was also something else. The certainty that, despite the risk, what was happening was wrong. "We're not alone, Julie," Sophie replied with determination. "Now that we know the truth, we have to act. But we can't do this without more information. We need to know what else is hidden in this mansion." Julie nodded, clenching her fists. She had decided to join the cause, but she knew that each step they took brought them closer to danger. Hector Morales' mansion was no longer just a place of luxury and power. It was a prison of secrets, and they were trapped inside. "I know my father's office is full of important papers. I've seen documents on his desk that I've never understood. Some seem to be related to the ownership of the mansion. If we could get in there without anyone noticing, we could find something that helps us, something that proves what Hector has done to his uncle." Sophie felt that Julie was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was at stake. Somehow, fear had turned into action. If they were going to do something, now was the time. "Where is his office?" Sophie asked, her eyes fixed on Julie. Julie paused, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "It's on the upper floor, in the right wing of the mansion. My father never allows anyone to go in there, not even my mother. It's always monitored by security cameras. It's a place I never have access to, but if we can disable the cameras for a while, we could get in." Sophie nodded, understanding the risk involved. If they wanted to get the evidence, they would have to face the security cameras and the possibility of being discovered by Hector or someone close to him. "Could Joseph help us with that?" Sophie asked, thinking of the gardener who seemed to be the only person outside the family still willing to help. Julie hesitated for a moment, but then nodded with determination. "I think so. He's the only one who has access to the security cameras. I've seen him several times manipulating the control panels when my father asks him to make adjustments in the mansion. If we talk to him, maybe he can help us." The conversation continued, planning every detail with the hope that they wouldn't be discovered. They knew the mission was dangerous, but the risk was necessary if they wanted to dismantle the control Hector had over the mansion and his own uncle. That same afternoon, after a long day of nerves and planning, Sophie and Julie met with Joseph. The young gardener seemed puzzled at first, but when Sophie explained what they needed, his face reflected a mix of surprise and fear. "I don't know if this is the right thing to do," Joseph said, glancing around as if afraid they were being overheard. Hector isn't someone you mess with so easily. He has contacts, people who do whatever he says. And if he finds out someone's looking for evidence against him, I don't know what might happen. Sophie placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of trust. She knew Joseph was their only hope if they wanted to succeed in their plan. We don't have another choice. You know what Hector is doing to his uncle. We can't let it continue. If we don't do something, Mr. Sebastian will stay trapped, and your father will continue to be a thief. We need you, Joseph. You're our only chance to make this happen. Joseph stood in silence for a moment, looking at the ground, clearly torn between his loyalty to his employer and the knowledge of the injustice happening right under his nose. Finally, he sighed deeply and lifted his head, looking at Sophie and Julie with a newfound resolve. All right, I'll help, but we have to be very careful. We can't risk being discovered. I have access to the cameras and the security system. I'll disable the cameras when the time is right, but you'll need to act fast, without leaving any trace. Julie, grateful but still nervous, nodded. We'll do it. We know what's at stake. If we find the documents that prove what Hector has been doing, we can stop him once and for all. The tension in the air increased as the plan took shape. Sophie, Julie, and Joseph knew that what they were about to do was not only risky, but would put their lives in danger. However, they also knew that they couldn't stand by while Hector Morales continued his abuse and manipulation. The conspiracy they had started weaving was now out of control, and there was only one path: confront Hector once and for all. Time was running out, and every move had to be calculated precisely. But as they moved forward, the truth seemed closer, and Sophie felt that justice, though distant, was beginning to take shape. The Morales mansion no longer seemed like the place of luxury and tranquility Sophie had once imagined. Every corner, every hallway, now hid dark secrets that Sophie could no longer ignore. As the conspiracy settled deeper into her mind, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fit, she felt that every step she took brought her closer to the truth. But she also knew that, at the same time, she was moving deeper into the darkness of a web of lies that could unravel at any moment. The night was calm when Sophie met with Julie and Joseph in the mansion's garden. They had agreed to act that very night. After several days of observation and planning, they had realized it was the right moment to make their move. The security cameras would be disabled by Joseph, and Julie knew her father spent most of the night in his office, reviewing documents or managing his business. If they were going to enter Hector's office and get the proof they needed, now was the perfect opportunity. But something in the air was changing. Sophie could feel it. There was something unsettling, something she couldn't quite identify, but it kept her on edge. As Julie explained in more detail how to access Hector's office, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Kate, the housekeeper. From the start, something about her had seemed strange, as if she was more involved than she let on. Although Sophie had initially thought Kate was simply loyal to Hector, something about her recent behavior was beginning to seem out of place. We need to be quick. If anyone realizes what we're doing, things will get complicated, Joseph interrupted her thoughts. I've disabled the cameras, but we won't have much time. Sophie nodded, but her mind kept returning to Kate. She remembered how she had seen the housekeeper observing Hector and Clara in the house, how she blended into the background, always present but unnoticed. That woman had access to places no one else could reach. What did she really know? Was she on their side, or was she playing her own game? Sophie decided that, before entering the office, she needed to confirm something. She had to verify if her suspicions about Kate were true. Without telling the others, Sophie veered off the path they had planned and headed to the service area, where she knew Kate spent much of her time. The mansion was large, but Sophie knew that if she moved quickly and cautiously, she wouldn't be discovered. When she arrived in the kitchen, Sophie noticed that it was unusually silent, much quieter than usual. The kitchen was always full of noise, whether from the housekeeper or servants coming in to grab something. But tonight, the silence was ominous. That's when she saw her, Kate, sitting at a table, a letter in her hands. She was staring intently at its contents, as if analyzing something. Sophie crept closer, trying not to make a sound, and as she peered in, she saw what Kate was holding, a set of documents with what appeared to be Mr. Sebastian's signature, and more importantly, a seal confirming the authenticity of the documents. Sophie held her breath. Kate wasn't just reviewing important documents, she seemed to have direct access to the information Hector had hidden. Somehow, Kate knew more than she had let on. At that moment, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure if Kate was an ally or a traitor, but what she did know was that she needed to confront her before everything fell apart. She decided to approach slowly. She didn't want to startle or alert her, but the opportunity to get answers was too big to let pass. When she was close enough, Sophie walked up to the table and in a low voice spoke. "Kate." The housekeeper turned, surprised by her presence, but Sophie stared directly into her eyes. "What are you doing with those documents?" Kate looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the words she was about to say. Finally, she sighed. She lowered her gaze to the papers and slowly tucked them into a drawer. "I don't know what you've seen, Sophie," she said, her voice heavy and somewhat tired, "but you have no idea what you're saying. Hector has been manipulating everything, and I can't stay silent anymore." Sophie watched her, still not fully understanding. "Why?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Why didn't you tell us anything? Why didn't you do something before?" Kate sighed deeply, as if a huge weight had fallen on her shoulders. "I've been part of this too, Sophie. Hector has been blackmailing me for years. I knew something was wrong, but fear kept me silent. But now, what he's doing to Mr. Sebastian, what he's doing to his own uncle, it's too much." Sophie, still shocked, took a step forward. For the first time, Kate seemed vulnerable. "So, are you with us?" Sophie asked, feeling that, despite the confusion, she was finally starting to understand the situation. Kate looked up, and for a moment, Sophie saw a mixture of rage and desperation in her eyes. "I don't have another choice." She stood up and opened the drawer where she had hidden the documents. "What Hector has been doing to his uncle is more than just a family betrayal. He's stripping Mr. Sebastian of everything he owns, and if I stay silent, I'm just as guilty as he is." Sophie nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of Kate's words. Now, the situation had changed. They had an ally inside the mansion, a piece that had been unknown until now, but would be crucial in their plan to free Mr. Sebastian. "So, what can we do?" Sophie asked, her mind racing. Kate leaned in close and whispered, "The only way to stop Hector is to expose all the documents. He's too confident, but if we manage to get definitive proof of what he's doing, we can stop him once and for all." Sophie nodded, knowing that this was the point of no return. From this moment on, there would be no turning back. The alliance with Kate might be the key to freeing Mr. Sebastian and exposing Hector. But they also knew that the consequences would be severe, and confronting Hector could destroy everyone involved. As Kate returned to her post, Sophie knew that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit. But what she didn't know was that, from this moment on, the shadows of the Morales mansion would grow denser, and any mistake could cost them their lives. The danger had never been so close, but justice was no longer an option. It was a necessity. The Morales mansion seemed quieter that night, as if the air itself had stopped, waiting for the next move. Sophie, Julie, and Joseph had gathered in the back garden, just like the previous nights, but something in their faces reflected a mix of tension and determination. Each of them knew that what they were about to do would not only risk their lives, but could bring down everything Hector had built over the years. The thought of directly confronting him, a feared and powerful man, filled them with anxiety, but fear wasn't enough to stop them. Sophie, with Mr. Sebastian's notebook still hidden in her backpack, had spent the whole day thinking about how to reach Hector's office without being discovered. They had decided that Joseph would disable the security cameras so they could move around without being watched, and Julie had obtained a copy of her father's office keys, something she had accomplished with great effort, using the excuse of helping around the house. The plan was in motion. Only one thing remained, ensuring everything went smoothly without being detected. "We're ready," said Joseph in a low voice, looking at his watch. "The security system is disabled, but we don't have much time. We need to get in and out as quickly as possible. I don't want to imagine what would happen if Hector finds out anyone has been in his office." Julie, her face tense, nodded, though a hint of doubt still showed in her eyes. "I know, but this is the right thing to do. If we can get those documents, Hector won't have a way out. It will all be over for him." Sophie, who had been quiet for a moment, took a deep breath and looked at Julie. "This is much bigger than we thought. It's not just about your grandfather. Hector has been stealing, manipulating, and all of this has been possible because he has the power to cover up the truth. If we don't act, the consequences will be worse. Not just for us, but for many others." Julie, hearing Sophie's words, seemed more determined. The fear had started to dissipate, replaced by an inner strength that only comes in moments of desperation. "I know. I'm with you both," she responded, looking at Sophie and Joseph with a new resolve on her face. "Let's do it." Without wasting any time, the three headed toward the mansion, taking the most discreet path toward Hector's office. The mansion seemed empty, with only a few lights on here and there, indicating that Hector had not yet retired for the night. Julie led the way down the hallway that led to the right wing, where her father's office was at the end of a long, dark corridor. When they reached the office door, Julie took the key from her pocket, her hands slightly trembling, and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a soft click, and the three of them slipped inside quietly. The office was filled with books, stacked papers, and elegant furniture, but at that moment, Sophie couldn't think of anything other than finding the documents they needed. Joseph quickly moved toward the filing system, which was near a large window. Sophie and Julie began carefully searching Hector's desk, moving papers cautiously. Everything in the office seemed under control, but Sophie knew that here lay the heart of Hector's manipulation. The documents that proved his betrayal, his theft, and his abuse of power. "Here," Julie said, finding a folder hidden under a pile of papers. The folder was sealed with a red ribbon. Julie hurriedly opened it, and inside, Sophie saw what she had been searching for. Contracts signed by Mr. Sebastian, property transactions, and most revealing of all, a forged will, signed and sealed by Hector. Sophie couldn't help but smile, although the tension in the air was still palpable. They had found what they needed. Now all that was left was to get it out of the mansion and present it as evidence of Hector's crimes. But at that moment, the sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway froze their blood. The three of them looked at each other in horror, knowing they didn't have time to leave the room without being seen. "Hector," Julie whispered, terrified. Sophie didn't hesitate for a second. She grabbed the papers and, with her heart racing, stuffed them into her backpack. Joseph quickly moved toward the window to make sure they could escape through there if necessary. Julie, meanwhile, tried to close the folder she had found, but there was no time. The footsteps were getting closer, and the sound of a door opening in the hallway shattered the silence. "Quick!" Sophie whispered. Just as they were about to leave, Hector appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure blocking the entrance. His eyes fixed on the three of them with icy fury, and for a moment, Sophie felt her heart stop. He had always been the man who controlled the mansion, the man who never hesitated, the man who had manipulated everything to his advantage. "What are you doing here?" Hector said, his voice cold as ice. "How did you get into my office?" The tension in the air was unbearable. Sophie couldn't let him discover that they had the evidence against him. She looked at Joseph, who was already near the window, and then at Julie, who seemed paralyzed by fear. But Sophie knew she couldn't let it end here. The truth had to come to light, even if it meant confronting Hector face to face. "We're looking for answers, Hector," Sophie said, keeping calm, though adrenaline coursed through her body. "What's happening in this mansion can't go on like this." Hector stared at her, evaluating her words, and in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition flashed. He knew something was off, but in that moment, Hector said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward, and his gaze shifted to Julie. "Are you involved in this too, Julie?" His voice sounded harsher, and Sophie could see the fear in the young woman's eyes. Hector had gone too far, and now the truth was beginning to unravel him. At that moment, Sophie understood that the time to confront Hector had arrived. There was no turning back now, and she couldn't let him get away with this. And if the confrontation was inevitable, she would fight with everything she had. "This game is over, Hector," Sophie said, her voice firm. "This is your last chance. What you've done is going to come to light." But Hector didn't stop. In a swift movement, he reached for the desk where his phone was, and before anyone could react, he was already dialing someone's number. "It's too late," he said with a sardonic smile. "You won't stop me." Sophie knew their time was running out. However, she couldn't give up. The final battle was about to begin. The air in the Morales mansion was tense, as if the walls themselves were preparing to collapse. Sophie, Julie, and Joseph stood before Hector, in the office that had been the center of his manipulations. The confrontation they had feared had arrived. Sophie felt the weight of the backpack on her back, the documents they had obtained hidden inside, the forged will that proved Hector's manipulation, the key to exposing everything. But at that moment, the sense of danger was overwhelming. Hector stood, watching them with his cold, calculating eyes, as if evaluating each of their movements. Sophie and Julie knew they couldn't let Hector gain an advantage. They had come too far, and what was at stake was bigger than themselves. But Hector's threat was clear. He was not a man who would accept being defeated easily, and in his gaze, it was clear he wouldn't yield without a fight. "Do you really think you can destroy everything I've built?" Hector said, his voice resonating with arrogance that filled the room. "All these years of work, of sacrifices, so that a little girl and a couple of naive fools get in my way. You have no idea what you're doing." Sophie didn't let herself be intimidated. She knew she was in a dangerous position, but something inside her, a mix of fury and determination, kept her steady. She couldn't let Hector continue his abuse and manipulation. "What you're doing is unforgivable, Hector," Sophie replied, her voice strong and clear. "You're stealing everything that belongs to your own uncle, and you've been doing it for years. The truth is coming to light, and you won't be able to stop us." Hector smiled crookedly, maintaining his composure, but Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew the situation was starting to crumble for him, though he refused to admit it. "You think you have control, but you have no idea how this world works," Hector said, slowly approaching the desk where his phone was resting. Sophie felt a pang of worry as she saw his hand moving toward the device. The sound of the phone ringing quickly confirmed her fears. Hector had called someone, probably his accomplices, to come help him out of this situation. Time was running out. "Hector, you can't keep ignoring what you've done," Julie said, her voice now filled with a bravery Sophie had never seen before. Julie was completely different from the frightened young woman she had been just days ago. The truth about what her father had done had transformed her into someone stronger. "I know you have your contacts. I know you've manipulated everything around you. But the people around you are also starting to realize what you really are." Hector didn't respond to Julie, but his face hardened. The young woman had hit a sensitive point. The man who had once controlled everything around him, who believed he was untouchable, now saw his world beginning to unravel. Sophie, seeing the opportunity, stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The truth was within reach, but they still had to expose it before Hector could do anything to stop them. "We have what we need to defeat you," Sophie said, looking Hector directly in the eyes, unafraid. "These documents prove what you've done. The truth is in our hands, and no matter how many contacts you have, you won't escape justice. Suddenly, Hector stopped smiling. The tension increased even more. Sophie felt the air growing thick, as though something big was about to explode. Hector had been so confident for so long, sure that they would never be able to defeat him. But now, seeing the determination in the eyes of the three people in front of him, something inside him began to crack. "You think you have control over this?" Hector said, his voice lower and more dangerous. "If you think you can expose me, you're very wrong. No one messes with me and gets away with it." That's when the sound of hurried footsteps outside the office made Sophie's fear intensify. She couldn't let Hector have time to make a call or alert anyone else. She knew that what they had in their hands was too valuable to let slip away. Suddenly, Sophie remembered Kate's words. The housekeeper had said that if they wanted to win, they had to act fast before Hector could alert his accomplices. At that moment, Sophie took another step forward, determined not to let anything or anyone steal their opportunity. "Joseph, now!" Sophie ordered, her voice firm. Joseph, who had been observing silently, without making a sound, nodded and quickly moved to the security system, deactivating what remained of the cameras in the area of the office. The brief moment of vulnerability that Hector had shown was enough for Julie to grab the phone from the desk and hold it up in front of him. "Here's the recording of everything we've found," Julie said, showing the phone with the recording of the conversation between Hector and his accomplices, the evidence directly implicating Hector in the manipulation of Mr. Sebastian's documents. "The truth can't be hidden anymore. Everything you've done is documented, and if you don't let Mr. Sebastian return to his life, if you keep destroying our family, this recording will be enough to put an end to everything you've done." The rage in Hector's eyes was palpable. He moved toward the desk, his face flushed with fury, but before he could do anything, they heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were arriving, alerted by Kate, who had called when everything started to fall apart. Hector's betrayal could no longer be hidden. His empire of lies was collapsing. Hector tried to move, but it was too late. The office door was suddenly flung open and several officers rushed in, taking control of the situation. Hector tried to speak, but the evidence Sophie, Julie, and Joseph had gathered was enough for the police to arrest him on the spot. Sophie watched everything in silence, her heart pounding. They had done the impossible, brought down Hector Morales. The mansion, which had been a symbol of power and control, was now the scene of justice. Sophie had won. But more importantly, the truth had won. As the officers led Hector out of the office, Sophie looked at Julie and Joseph. She knew the path was still not finished, that Mr. Sebastian's life wasn't yet resolved, but this victory was a crucial step. "We did it," Sophie said, her voice trembling but firm. "But now, we have to free your grandfather, Julie. This is just the beginning." And with that, the battle against Hector Morales, the man who had manipulated and destroyed so many lives, came to an end. But the fight for justice had only just begun. The Morales mansion was no longer the intimidating fortress it had once been. The news of Hector Morales' arrest had spread quickly, and the mansion, which had recently been filled with dark secrets, now seemed to be crumbling from the inside. Sophie, Julie, and Joseph had done the unthinkable. They had unraveled the web of lies and abuse that Hector had woven so skillfully. The process of Hector's downfall had begun with the revelation of his corruption, and with his arrest, the Morales mansion was ready to be transformed. But despite the victory, there was a strange feeling hanging over Sophie, the feeling that the work was still not finished. They had exposed Hector, but the liberation of Mr. Sebastian remained the ultimate goal. The mansion was still a place of suffering for him, and Sophie knew she wouldn't rest until she saw him free. The day after Hector's arrest, Sophie, Julie, and Joseph gathered in the mansion's garden, just as they had during the past few days. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the garden paths, but Sophie's face held a mix of emotions. The peace she had hoped for had not yet come. "How is your mother?" Joseph asked, looking at Sophie with concern. Sophie sighed. The past few weeks had been exhausting, and her mother, Rose, was still struggling with her health. Although the medical treatment Mr. Sebastian had provided had improved her condition, the damage had already been done. Rose was still far from fully recovered. "Better. A little stronger every day," Sophie replied, but her tone showed the emotional weight she was still carrying. "But I can't rest yet. We need to make sure Mr. Sebastian is okay." Julie, who had been observing in silence, nodded with an expression of determination. "My father has no power here anymore. The mansion belongs to Mr. Sebastian, and what I want most is to see him free, as it should have been from the beginning." Sophie nodded, noticing in Julie's voice a resolution that hadn't been there before. Julie had changed. She had gone from being an obedient daughter, trapped in her father's lies, to a young woman willing to fight for what was right. Sophie felt that the relationship between them, once distant, was now stronger, united by their shared struggle for justice. Just then, a black car approached the main entrance of the mansion. Sophie, Julie, and Joseph immediately stood up, watching the arrival with anticipation. Mr. Sebastian, the man whose life had been marked by manipulation and suffering, was finally going to return to his place in the mansion. Although the wounds were deep, there was something else in him that could not be ignored. A spark of hope, of life, that had remained intact despite the years of abuse. The car stopped, and Mr. Sebastian stepped out of the vehicle with the help of a doctor who accompanied him. Though his figure still seemed fragile, his eyes shone with a strength Sophie had never seen before. Mr. Sebastian's dignity, though bruised by time and circumstances, was beginning to resurface. When he saw Sophie and Julie, his face lit up with a faint but sincere smile. "Thank you for not giving up," Mr. Sebastian said softly, as he saw the two young women approach him. Sophie felt the weight of the mission she had undertaken finally begin to lift. They had faced so much, but seeing Mr. Sebastian free, seeing that their struggle had been worth it, was the greatest reward she could receive. No matter how much he had suffered, he was now free. The Morales mansion was no longer a symbol of oppression, but a reminder of what truth and justice could achieve. Mr. Sebastian walked slowly toward the entrance of the mansion, where the house staff, now under his command, received him with respect. The mansion, which had recently been a space of manipulation and fear, was beginning to transform into a home of hope. Hector's control had crumbled, and now Mr. Sebastian, the true owner, was ready to take the reins of his life once again. "This mansion is yours, Mr. Sebastian," Sophie said as she walked beside him. "And everything you've lost, everything Hector took from you, we'll get it back." Mr. Sebastian looked at Sophie with a mix of gratitude and sadness. He had lost so much, but in that moment, it seemed that life still had something to offer him. Hope had returned to the mansion. "I don't hold on to resentment," Mr. Sebastian replied, looking at the walls that had once been filled with pain. "But what hurts the most is that the people I loved the most are the ones who suffered the consequences of my mistakes. My sister, my brother. I should have done something sooner." Julie, hearing her grandfather's words, approached and took his hand. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Everything that had happened, all the struggles, had been worth it. Mr. Sebastian, though still fragile, was taking control of his life again, and that was what really mattered. "What matters is that we're here now," Julie said with a smile, "and together we'll rebuild what was lost." Sophie looked at Julie, and for a moment she realized how much she had changed in such a short time. The mansion, once a symbol of oppression, was now a symbol of resistance and redemption. Every room that had witnessed lies and abuse would now be a place where truth could live. That night, the Morales mansion hosted a dinner that not only marked Mr. Sebastian's return to his home, but also the beginning of a new chapter. The table, once cold and distant, was now filled with laughter and conversation, with shared hope. Sophie, sitting beside her mother, who was feeling much better, and her brother Matthew, allowed herself to breathe for the first time in a long while. The scars were still present, but they were now part of a past that no longer dictated the future. Mr. Sebastian raised his glass of wine at the end of the meal, looking at everyone with a smile that had been hidden for years. To you, I owe my freedom, my family, my life. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Sophie raised her glass too, looking around. The mansion was no longer a place of suffering. It was now a home of hope. And as the moonlight illuminated the mansion, Sophie felt that at last the future was shining with new possibilities. Justice had prevailed, and the path to healing was open for all. The fall of Hector Morales had only been the beginning. Now, with the truth in their hands and a future full of promises, Sophie knew that her life and her family's life would begin anew, in a home where justice, courage, and truth would always be the pillars. The mansion, once filled with shadows, was beginning to shine with a new light. The dawn peeked over the Morales mansion, painting the white stone walls with a warm golden glow. The mansion, which had recently been a place of suffering, dark secrets, and fear, now breathed new life. Sophie, standing at the entrance of the grand hall, watched as the sun illuminated the garden that, once neglected, now bloomed in vibrant colors. It was a new day, a new beginning, and she knew that everything that had happened over the past few months had changed not only her life, but also that of her family and Mr. Sebastian. The process of recovering everything Hector Morales had stolen had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. Hector's arrest, Mr. Sebastian's return to his home, the liberation of the mansion, and the exposure of the crimes committed under his rule all came together in a single effort, a battle that, although costly, had resulted in victory, not just for them, but for justice. That morning, Sophie was with her mother, Rose, who, after receiving proper medical care, was feeling much better. Her mother's health had improved considerably, and though there was still work to be done, Sophie could see a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. Matthew, her younger brother, was running through the garden, laughing and playing with a small toy car that Mr. Sebastian had given him. The sound of his laughter was a melody Sophie hadn't expected to hear again, and the young woman's heart filled with gratitude. After everything they had been through, after all the struggles, the end had been worth it. "How are you feeling today, Mum?" Sophie asked as she approached Rose, who was sitting in a chair by the garden, enjoying the morning sun. Rose looked at her with a smile, and though her body was still somewhat weak, her spirit seemed to have revived. "I feel better, Sophie," Rose replied softly. "Not just because of the medicine they gave me, but because I see that things are changing. Thanks to you. Thank you for never giving up." Sophie smiled and sat next to her mother, taking her hand. The weight of the last few months seemed to dissipate little by little, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie allowed herself to feel that everything she had done, all the difficulties she had faced, had been worth it. Not far from there, Mr. Sebastian walked slowly through the garden, helped by a doctor and accompanied by Julie, who had decided to stay at the mansion to help her grandfather adjust to his new life. Despite the fragility of his body, Mr. Sebastian showed a renewed strength in his face. He had spent years under Hector's oppression, but now he was free, and the weight of the guilt he had carried for so long was beginning to fade. He had regained what belonged to him, not just the mansion, but his dignity. Sophie got up and walked toward him, feeling a sense of pride for everything they had accomplished together. Julie, seeing Sophie approach, looked at her with a smile. "Hello, Sophie," Julie greeted her, her voice calm but filled with satisfaction. "Mr. Sebastian is starting to get used to his new life. Sometimes he still seems to be looking for something, but I know that soon he will feel completely at home here." Sophie looked at Mr. Sebastian, who smiled faintly when he saw the two young women approaching. In his eyes, there was a light of gratitude and hope, something Sophie had never seen in him before. "Thank you, Sophie," Mr. Sebastian said in a soft but firm voice. "Not only for returning what belongs to me, but for giving me a new chance to live. This house, which once was a place of suffering and fear, is now my home. And that's thanks to you and Julie." Sophie felt a lump in her throat, but her heart was pounding. The feeling of having done the right thing, of having achieved what seemed impossible, overwhelmed her. "I didn't do it alone, Mr. Sebastian. Julie and Joseph were also part of all this. We wouldn't have gotten here without you." Mr. Sebastian nodded, looking at Julie with pride. "Yes, you're right. You've all been part of this struggle. And now we have a chance to live in peace, to rebuild what Hector destroyed." Julie looked at her grandfather, her face full of mixed emotions. Although the path to healing would be long, she knew this was the beginning of something completely new, a future filled with hope, justice, and finally, freedom. "I know we have a lot ahead of us, Grandpa, but the important thing is that we're together, and that's what matters." The afternoon passed slowly, with a sense of calm and unity that Sophie had never experienced in that mansion. As Sophie's family and Mr. Sebastian's gathered around the table, sharing a simple meal full of meaning, Sophie couldn't help but think of everything that had happened. The fight against Hector, the lies that had been exposed, the courage they had shown in confronting injustice. All of that had brought them together, and now, at last, they could see the reward for their bravery. Mr. Sebastian, looking at everyone present, raised his glass in a toast. "To you, my brave ones, to the family that never gave up the fight for justice, and to a better future, one in which fear has no place. May we always remember that the truth, though late, always triumphs." Sophie raised her glass, looking at her mother, her brother Julie, and Mr. Sebastian. The future seemed brighter than ever. They had been witnesses to the fall of a man who believed that power gave him control over the lives of others. But now, the Morales mansion was a symbol of the fight for justice, a place where truth had finally prevailed. "To truth," Sophie said, with a smile full of hope. "To justice. And to family." The glasses were raised, and for the first time in a long while, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the Morales mansion. It was no longer a place of darkness, but a home filled with light and love. As the night advanced, Sophie allowed herself to breathe deeply. Everything she had done, everything she had fought for, had been worth it. The future shone before her, full of possibilities. The mansion, which had been the epicenter of pain, was now filled with the promise of a new beginning. The past had been left behind, and the future, bright and full of hope, lay ahead of them. And with that, we come to the end of our story. I hope you've enjoyed every chapter and the incredible journey of Sophie, Julie, and Mr. Sebastian in their fight for justice and truth. As always, remember that hope and courage can change destiny, no matter how difficult the circumstances may seem. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming adventures. Also, leave us your comments. We want to know what you thought of the journey of these special characters. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey, and until next time, see you in the next video.